I was torn about whether to talk to Donald Trump on this podcast. As a historian, what would you advise?
I think, I mean, this is a difficult question, right? For historians who want, sort of want to make sure that they know sort of what Americans are thinking and talking about, for centuries later. So one of the things that, at least my understanding is that when President Trump was banned from Twitter, his account was also deleted. And that is one of the most valuable sources that historians will use to understand the era. And parts of it were sort of, archived and
Yes.
reconstructed. But in that sense, I think that that is also a real loss to the historical record. Um, I mean, I think that your podcast shows you'll talk to anyone. I'm here, right?
Right, right.
I'm not in the business of saying don't talk to me.
That's one of the difficult things when I think about Hitler. I think Hitler, Stalin. I don't know if World War One quite has the same intensity of controversial leaders. But one of the sad things from a historian perspective is how few interviews Hitler has given or Stalin has given.
Hmm.
And that's such a difficult thing because it's obvious that talking to Donald Trump, that talking to Xi Jinping, talking to Putin is really valuable from a historical perspective to understand. But then you think about the momentary impact of such a conversation and you think, well, depending on how the conversation goes, you could steer or flame, what is it, feed the flame of war or conflict or abuses of power and things like this. And that's, I think, the tension between the journalist and the historian.
Hmm.
Because when journalists interview dictators, for example, one of the things that strikes me is they're often very critical of the dictator. They're like they're basically attacking them in front of their face as opposed to trying to understand. Because what I perceive they're doing is they're signaling to the other journalists that they're on the right side of history, kind of thing. But that's not very productive. And it's also why the dictators and leaders often don't do those interviews. It's not productive to understanding who the human being is. To understand, you have to empathize. Um, because few people, I think, few leaders do something from a place of malevolence. I think they really do think they're doing good. And not even for themselves, not even for selfish reasons. I think they're doing great they're doing the right thing for their country or for whoever the group they're leading. And to understand that, you have to, and by the way, a large percent of the country often supports them. I bet if you legitimately poll people in North Korea, they will believe that their leader is doing the right thing for their country. And so to understand that, you have to empathize. So that's the tension of the journalist, I think, and the historian, because obviously the historian doesn't care. They really want to. They care obviously deeply, but they know that history requires deep understanding of the human being in the full context. Uh, yeah, it's a tough decision to make.
Yeah. Well, I think it's both for journalists and historians. The challenge is not to be too close to your subject, right? And not to be overly influenced and used by them, right? When you're talking to a living subject, which historians do, too. Um, it's a matter of making sure that you triangulate their story with the rest of the record, right? And that may paint a different picture of the person than and will prevent you as a journalist or a historian from kind of just telling someone else's story. And historians also have the benefit of going back 30, 40 years and finding all the other stories and figuring out you know playing two truths and a lie, like which parts are accurate, which are not. And journalists do that work on a day-to-day basis, but historians, we get a little more time to think about what we're doing.
Well, I personally also think it's deeply disrespectful to the populace, to people, to censor and ignore a person that's supported by a very large number of people. Like that, you owe, I personally feel like you owe the citizens of this country a deep empathy and understanding of the leaders they support, even if you disagree with what they say. I mean, that's the to me, I'm much more worried about the resentment
Mhm.
of the censorship. Um, that it's to having a good conversation with Donald Trump is ultimately valuable because I think, especially in this case, I agree with you that Donald Trump is not a singular person. He represents a set of feelings that a large number of people have, and whatever those feelings are, you can try to figure out by talking to people, but also talking to the man, and then seeing the interplay there. What does this really represent in this period in history, in this slice of the world? Yeah, ultimately, understanding I think leads to compassion and love and unity, which is how this whole thing progresses. The tension between the different sides is useful to have a good conversation, but ultimately coming up with the right answer and progressing towards that answer is how you make progress.